Good morning and welcome. I'm Daphne Richards, Travis County Horticulture Agent with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Thank you for joining us for this webinar and our Drought to Deluge gardening series. We have a great program lined up for you today, Turfgrass Management with Water in Mind. As part of this program, our presenter may refer to various source material or websites. Don't panic if you don't catch those in time to write them down. All registrants will receive a follow-up email chock full of good stuff, including a link to the recorded session and links to any references or resources listed, including a link to the recorded session. Today, we'll be taking some questions at the break, as well as at the end of the program. In order to pose a question, you'll need to use the Q&A feature. Simply type in your question at any point. We'll address those two at a time during our mid-program break and at the end. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can, and we'll follow up after the program on any that we don't get to. Our presenter today is Dr. Chrissy Segars, who serves from her home base at the AgriLife Research and Extension Center in Dallas as the Extension Turfgrass Specialist for the entire state of Texas. As such, she supports extension educational programming across the turfgrass industry. Her research efforts focus on a systems approach where primary goals are user safety and healthy turfgrass using site-specific best management practices. Her energy and enthusiasm for all things turf is infectious, and I'm excited to have her with us today. So without further ado, Dr. Segars, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Daphne. Let me share my screen really quick. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm very happy to be here today, and I am very gracious to be asked to do this, and happy to be a part of the Travis County Education Series. So let's go ahead and get started. Like Daphne said, we are going to talk about turfgrass management principles, but keep that water in mind. And so we will focus a little bit on water, but I know in about a month's time, y'all are getting a good irrigation talk. So I won't focus too much on the details, just how our management practices can affect our water use and the ability of our turfgrass to grow. So I always like to start out with talking about the Dallas Center. And so in Texas, we have two different turfgrass breeding and research programs. So we have one research program down at the College Station, Texas A&M campus, and then we have a research and a breeding program up at our Dallas Center. And so this is our turfgrass breeder. Her name is Dr. Ambika Chandra. And so she's been with us about 12, 13 years. And so she has been very successful throughout her program. So we are attempting to breed new cultivars of turfgrass, specifically St. Augustine and zoysia grass, that are number one drought tolerant. That is the number one trait that we look for. And so you can kind of see in some of these photos, hey, you know, a lot of the things we do, we put these grasses under rainout shelters and we just turn the water off and we see how they're going to do. So what if you gain anything from this presentation, I want you to gain that not all turf grasses are created equal. One turf grass might work in someone else's situation, but not work in your situation. Might work in one part of the state, might not work in another part of the state. And so during this presentation, I want you to think about your situation. What do you have going on in your yard? What kind of microclimate have you created in your yard? Because you can see, look at this right photo over here. This is a drone image of one of our zoysia grass blocks. You can see that there is a vast difference in how these grasses can react. You can see that there are some really, really green ones, and there's some that aren't even there anymore. And so this is what we're trying to do, you know, make grasses that use I don't know what happened there, use less inputs, but can still provide a quality lawn. So sometimes turf grass can get a bad reputation. You know, we get that reputation that that we're water hogs, we're water guzzling grasses. Those grasses take too much fertilizer. They take too many chemicals. They're ruining the environment. But hopefully you'll learn today that these grasses don't take as much as we really think, or maybe that we used to have to do with some of our grasses. We have vastly improved grasses now that can withstand drought, that can withstand saline conditions, that can withstand more diseases and pests than ever before. But look at all these resources that we can get from turfgrass. Turfgrasses really are the best plant in the world. And so you might be laughing to yourself, but I love turfgrass. It's number one, it's soil erosion control. It is something that we can put on the top of our ground to limit the loss of one of our most precious resources, soil. And now typically I say soil. I'm from South Carolina, but a lot of times people are like, what is she saying? So I have to enunciate a little bit. But look at all these great benefits, especially being in an urban environment. We are getting so many great benefits: stabilization from the aspect of dust, heat dissipation, glare reduction. It's taking in CO2, it's storing CO2, so it's helping us with our greenhouse gas problem. So we're actually storing CO2 and creating oxygen for us to breathe. So tons of resources. Now, for our turfgrass area, what is our goal? We want to create a practical turfgrass area. We don't want to just have grass out there for the sake of having grass, right? And so we want to create areas that are usable for, different activities or what have it. But think about this question. Do you believe that a water conserving landscape can contain turfgrass? I bet a lot of you are saying no. But hopefully, as we move through this presentation, you will see that it can indeed contain turfgrass if we are willing to manage it like it would like to be managed. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the problem with water. So as you can see, we have some issues in the drought department sometimes in our state. Now, Travis County is very similar to Dallas County, where we're getting, approximately 35 inches a year. But the old joke says, hey, 35 inches, 30 inches is great, but it might all come in a couple months, or it might all come, the old joke is, oh, it came that one weekend, and so sometimes the pattern of that precipitation can be undesirable. So I pulled these off of the drought monitor website, and you can see that, in April, some of our state is in a drought. I think we're a little bit behind on our rainfall for the month of March. Moving on into April, though, you can see the precipitation that we've gotten in the state of Texas from the beginning of the year until the beginning of April. And so we are a little bit behind with our precipitation this year, but that brings challenges, right? We have a growing population in the state of Texas. We have a lot of folks moving into our urban areas, Austin area, Dallas area, San Antonio. All of those places are seeing population growth, and so that can lead to a water resource issue, right? Climate change, we're having different changes of our climate patterns. We can see that our USDA hardiness zones are moving up, so it's getting warmer. Water quality is becoming some issues in some locations where we just see an overall decline in some of our water quality. And so what does that mean for our turf grass? Another thing is we're having competition for water, right? And so we only have so much in some cases. And so who is going to get that water? Sometimes that's a political thing. Sometimes policies can change. And so sometimes we have to deal with just lack of water from a resource front. Now, what is the role? Now, this can get a little complicated. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what is the role of water in turfgrass physiology? Now, I'm not going to expect you to remember all of this, but at one point in your life, you have seen the inside of a cell before. And so I show this to say, I just want to emphasize how important water is in our turfgrass and in our normal plants, in our everyday plants. So, transporting nutrients, keeping those cells rigid where the plant's not wilting, opening that stomata where we see when the stomata opens, that's a little portion on our leaf that is going to open to allow the plant to cool itself. And so it's very important in our physiological processes, photosynthesis, transpiration, respiration, all those processes that we see those plants go through to be able to grow. Water is vital for those plants to have. We don't need to worry about the details, but this is just to emphasize, hey, water's doing a lot more than just keeping that grass green. There's so many functions inside that plant that water is a huge component of. So not only inside the plant, it's very important for the turf grass, the soil, and the water to have a positive relationship. So we know that in order for our plants to make oxygen, they have to take in carbon dioxide, right? But when that uptake occurs, we're losing water. And so our roots, our leaves, our internal characteristics, they have roles in taking in that CO2 so photosynthesis can happen, so our plant can grow. And so basically, if our soil is not simpatico, I guess, with our turf and our water, then the plant responses are going to be all over the place. We're not going to be able to move that water from the soil into the plant if we don't have a good relationship. And so this might be too much for us today, but just emphasizing, hey, water is vital for that plant to be able to grow. And so we'll see throughout this presentation, how can we meet those turfgrass water requirements? And so you're hopefully, this is going to be very specific to your turfgrass. So there's a lot of different factors in play. We're trying to meet those requirements, but in order to do that, we need to have knowledge about our specific species. Do we have Bermuda grass? Do we have St. Augustine? And then within those species, what kind of variety or cultivar do we have? There's hundreds of varieties and cultivars out there. So just knowing which one we have is going to help that plant function the way it's supposed to. So this is this picture here shows a turfgrass trial where this is actually Kentucky bluegrass. I should have chosen a better photo, but so this is actually all irrigated the same way. And you can see that not all of the varieties, not all of the cultivars are responding the same way. And so this is where it becomes specific for your situation, your climate, your macroclimate versus your microclimate in your yard. Evapotranspiration. This is very important for knowing how much water we need to give our turfgrass. We're going to talk about this more in detail, but excuse me. Evapotranspiration is the loss of water from the plant and the soil. Evaporation from the soil, transpiration from the plant. And then drought tolerance. This is going to be species and variety dependent. And all of these things are going to be connected to our management practices. How are we mowing? How are we fertilizing? How are we giving supplemental irrigation? All of this can affect how we can meet our turfgrass water requirements. And so it can get rather complicated very quickly, but just knowing some basic management practices, ideals can really help us manage our water as well. So whenever we're thinking about turfgrass, whenever we're thinking about the type of grass we want, the type of grass we can use in our situation, it's very important for you to take up these factors into consideration. Well, heat and drought tolerance. We already know that we live in Central Texas is going to be hot for the majority of the year. Now, we are going to have some times where we experience cold weather. We had a very extreme cold weather event this year, but that's not going to be something that happens extremely regularly, right? And so, in general, we're going to rely more on the heat and drought tolerance rather than the cold tolerance where we are located in Central Texas. So, we need to choose a species that's going to be able to hold up to that. Irrigation requirements. Now, if you have an irrigation system, what is it? Is it underground? Are you just going to be using a sprinkler? Are you going to be using a hose that you may use every once in a while? And how willing are you to use that irrigation? And so a lot of times during our high drought moments of the summer, if we're in a drought, we might have something called a water restriction, right? And so are we going to be able to use that irrigation? Do we want to use it? How willing are we to use it? And so that can go and play big into the different performance factors. And then traffic tolerance, desired use. How are you using that yard? Are you using it as an ornamental lawn where you might, have a couple of events on it a year? Or do you have, a couple dogs? Do you have a bunch of children that are running around on that yard? That's going to influence what type of species we want to choose. And then the biggest thing, what are your expectations? Are you expecting for this yard to look like a golf course fairway? Or do you just want to have something on your soil? Do you just want to have some type of vegetative cover? So, a lot of times we come in with very high expectations. Well, I am committed to mowing and fertilizing this yard to make it look like the best yard in the neighborhood. Okay. Are you serious about that? A lot of times we'll come in with that, and about 2-3 months later we kind of start dipping down. I don't really feel like mowing the grass today. I want to go do something else. I don't really want to put that fertilizer down. I don't really want to spray those weeds. And so, what are our expectations? What are we setting ourselves up for? What are we capable of doing? And what do we want to do? And so the biggest thing that we need to think about is the sunlight that we have in our area. Now, we are going to be primarily growing warm season grasses here. And so, you can grow some cool season species in some of our Texas environments, but primarily we are going to be using warm season grasses. They're much better suited for our Texas climate. However, they do have a high sunlight requirement compared to our cool season grasses. Now, when we talk about grasses that can grow in the shade, no grass really likes to grow in the shade. They all prefer more light. Now, you might notice, in the hotter times of the year, your grasses in your shadier environments might be doing a little better than your grasses in your full sun environment. But that's, just because it's so hot. Even our warm season grasses have a threshold where they're just going to stop growing in the heat. And so, biggest question I get from homeowners, anybody with a residential yard is, what can I grow under that tree? Or what can I grow near that shady fence in between my yard, or in between my house and my fence? There's a whole shaded environment over there. What can I grow? So we're not going to get into the specifics right now, but we will talk about some species selection in the second half of this presentation. But this is the general sunlight requirement. Bermuda grass, buffalo grass are going to have the highest sunlight requirement. They will not consistently grow in a shady environment. And then you can see our typical old St. Augustine grass is known as our shade warm season grass. But even St. Augustine needs sunlight. It cannot grow under a dense shaded environment. So keep that in mind whenever you are thinking about how you're managing your yard, or if you can even have grass in that area. Okay, so keep those things in mind. So water conserving turfgrass species. Now, Bermuda grass is, or let me start over. Buffalo grass is our only native turf grass to the US. Every other grass that we have, turfgrass wise, is either an introduced species or an accidental introduce. However it got over here, either accidental or on purpose. And so now, when I say turf grass, I mean a species that can be mowed low. And so, of course, we have other native grass species like little blue stem and side oats and those types of things. But in relation to turf grass, buffalo grass is our only native turf grass to the US. And so you can see our relative drought tolerance over here. So Bermuda grass and buffalo grass are going to be our most drought tolerant species. Now we will talk about the difference between those later. Genetics can play a large part in drought tolerance, and that's why Bermuda grass can be up there so high as well. Even though it's an introduced species, it's very, very adapted to our climate and our area in Texas. Now, zoysia grass can also be water conserving, but these grasses act differently when they have limited water. So we'll talk about that as we move forward. But this is just like a relative guide for you to know that some grasses are going to be more drought tolerant than others, but they can act very differently. Okay, so once we choose a species, once we choose a turf grass, how can I optimize that water use efficiency of that grass? And you can see over here, fate of water applied to a turf grass root zone. There's so many things that can happen, right? How can we optimize that grass? Number one, taking up that water when it's there. And then once we have taken up the water, how can we optimize that turf grass to use that water efficiently? So there's a lot of different factors here, but the three that we are going to concentrate on are mowing. How does mowing affect our water use? Fertilization. How can fertilizer affect the ability of our grass to use water? And then irrigation. How can me applying supplemental irrigation affect my turf grass? Now, there are, of course, are other things for you to do, but we just don't have time to talk about them today. But aeration, which is very related to soil health, how can that help? And then overall pest management, of course, can help. The less stressed our grasses are, the more efficiently they can use the water and take up the water that we are giving them. Okay. So, and remember, if you have any questions as I'm going to type them into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those at the break. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is mowing. Now, if whether or not you fertilize, whether or not you control your weeds, whether or not you give your grass supplemental irrigation, everyone is going to do this practice in some shape or form. Mowing is our most basic cultural practice. And so however you do it, you're going to do it though, right? The periodic removal of the part of the turf grass shoot. And so we're mowing the leaves off, right? And so regardless of what we do, we're going to mow, all right? And so mowing, most basic, but also most important, most overlooked cultural practice. Now, the reason that turf grasses can be mowed so low to the ground is due to where that growing point of the plant is. Now, the growing point of the plant is going to be called the crown. So that's the meristem, the apical meristem of that plant. Now, that crown is going to be situated either right at the soil surface or just below the soil surface. And so that's the reason why we can mow grasses so low. Now, when we accidentally mow grasses too low, so we've scalped our plant, we have taken off more than the recommended amount, which is generally about 1/3 of that leaf blade. We have taken off too much, then that is when our grasses are going to look ugly and brown, and that crown has been damaged. If it's damaged too much, then the grass can actually die. And so this is why mowing heights are so important. Mowing frequency is so important. So once you set a height of mowing, let's say I'm mowing my grass at 2 inches. I need to mow that grass again before it reaches 3 inches. So I need to mow it at a time where I'm not removing more than about 1/3 of that plant material. Okay. Now, the regrowth is going to occur from just cell division, mitosis, and elongation, and that's going to take place below the height of that mower blade. And so all of this is connected to all of these different physiological processes. This is why we can mow grass so low, and that's why it regrows through physiological processes that water is helping. And so whenever we talk about mowing, root growth is very related to the height of our grass. And so there's something called a shoot root ratio. And so the lower we mow our grass, the shorter we can expect our roots to be. Now that's in general. And so if we were to happen to go out there and mow our grass really low at one time, we scalped it, then we can expect our roots to want to reach that root shoot ratio again. And so if the grass is going to be cut low all of a sudden, we can expect some of our root growth to just go away. Roots will pretty much just slough themselves off. They'll die off to reach that root shoot ratio. So then what happens to the ability of our plant to take in the water? Well, our roots are a lot shorter now, so the roots can't reach that water that might be down in that soil profile. And so, roots are where we're taking up our water and our nutrients. So root health is very important. And so you can kind of see by this little graphic here that, root growth is very related to the height of the grass that you're going to grow. And so whenever we mow, we are causing a stress to our grass. But defoliation of grasses is nothing new. They're used to it, right? They can take it. So we're asking a lot of our grasses. We are basically beating them up every time we mow. And so mowing can be a great avenue for stress causing organisms to come in. If we're not sharpening our blades enough, if we're not keeping our blades changed appropriately, then that can be a port of entry for disease causing organisms. And also a temporary increase in that water loss, reduced water absorption by those roots. But our mowing is nothing new to these grasses. And so we'll learn a little bit more about it as we keep going. But a lot of things in our plant is related to mowing. A lot of storage of energy, a lot of production of carbohydrates are related to mowing. Okay, so this is a general guideline. I think that Cheryl will share these resources with you at the end, but this is coming off of our Aggie Turf website. These are some common mowing recommendations for warm season grasses. So you can see the common name over here: Bermuda grass common, hybrid Bermuda grass, buffalo grass, St. Augustine, 2 different types of zoysias that we have. And so, depending on what your site is, then we have kind of a recommended range of mowing heights that we suggest. Excuse me. Now, you can do what you like, right? And so typically I'll tell homeowners, hey, if you like your grass mowed a little lower, then you're going to be committing to mowing more frequently, right? But the higher your grass is, the less you typically have to mow it, and just because of the growing heights and all of that. And so there's not a perfect answer out there. Sometimes it just goes back to what you like, the ability that you have to mow these grasses, and what kind of climate you have in your yard. And so changing these mowing heights throughout the year, seasonally, depending on heat, depending on shade, might be something that you can look into. So this is off of this document, Mowing Recommendations for Warm Season Turf Grasses, which this is just one little blip of that publication. There's a ton of information in there that you can look at. All right. Now, mowing height and frequency. So this is a lot of information, and we'll go through it pretty slowly. So when we mow our grass higher, high cut turf, so maybe we prefer a little bit higher height than our neighbor. This is going to lead to an increased water use of your plant as a result of just more leaf surface area, right? Now, when we cut it too low, we see a reduced water use due to that canopy and less surface area. So in general, the higher you mow your turf, the more water your grass is going to need to use. The lower you cut it, the less water it will need to use because it doesn't have as much plant surface. But we do have some trade-offs there. The less amount of plant surface that we have, the less amount of photosynthesis that can occur. We need leaf area for photosynthesis to occur. When we increase our height, we see some not only increased water use, but we're also going to have better rooting mass. Remember earlier we talked about the shoot height being very correlated to the root length. So we have a trade-off there, right? So we've got some increased water use, but technically our roots should be longer, should have a larger mass that's able to find water more easily into that soil. And so we kind of get a trade-off of we're enhancing our rooting, but we might be minimizing some of our leaf surface area in some of these cases. And so the bottom line on these are that we want to mow as high as we are comfortable with, but we want to mow more often, okay? And so frequency is very important. We want to mow enough where we are not removing too much of our grass at one time. But when we mow frequently enough, we can also get some benefits from our clippings. So returning clippings to our yard in a regular instance can lead to more nutrients in our yard. As long as we're not returning too much clippings at once, then our microbes in our soil can't break those down readily enough, okay? And so moving on with that, with mowing to fertilization. So how can fertilization influence growth and water use? We often recommend to fertilize because we want to have a higher quality of grass. And so fertilizer can lead to dense, healthy lawns that can weed out the weeds, right? But turf grass grown under excessive nitrogen, so N is going to stand for nitrogen, it's going to have higher evaporative demand, which will lead it to be more prone to wilt. So basically, in a nutshell, excess nitrogen can be very detrimental to not only turf grass quality, but it can lead to having a higher demand for water, right? So it's going to lead to it being more prone to wilt. So we don't want to overdo it. Now, how can we figure out how much nutrients that we want? We can, number one, take a soil test, right? So, have you taken a soil test before? When was it performed? How was it performed? Should you take another? Have you had any problem areas all of a sudden show up? What about some other soil health questions in your yard? Do you have drainage issues in some of your yard? Do you have compaction issues? So these are some things that we need to address whenever we are considering fertilizing our yard. We need to be aware of how our soil is reacting. And so I know everybody in this has heard before, how do you take a soil test? But let's go over it really quick. So um, we have a lab at Texas A&M, of course, and I'm biased to use that because I think it's a great lab and it can give you some great recommendations. But there are other labs in the state. So whichever one you decide to use, go ahead and choose that. You obtain a sample bag, instructions from that lab. And then what we want to do is make sure that we're collecting that sample in the way that that lab wants. And so the A&M lab will say, let's get about 10 to 15 representative samples, cores. If you have an auger, if you have a soil tube, or hey, I just have a trowel or a shovel, spade shovel, this can show you right here how you can take those soil samples. And so we want to go about 4 to 6 inches in depth, right around that typical root zone of the turf grasses. And then we want to look at our website, our sheet, and select the samples that we want to get taken. So I'll show you an example of that here. So what kind of samples can we get taken? You know, routine analysis is going to show us pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, some of our other macronutrients. But what I want to caution you on here is what nutrients should you be looking at on the soil test? Now, the A&M lab specifically uses a nitrogen soil test in the form of nitrate, so NO3. Now, nitrogen is highly mobile in the soil. And so if I took my soil sample today and it either rained or I watered my yard or what have it, the nitrogen rate can change very rapidly, okay? Especially depending on what kind of soil we have. And so whenever we start talking about how to fertilize with nitrogen, we are going to base the nitrogen not on the soil test. Do not use the recommended rate for the soil test when it comes to nitrogen. We are going to use what type of species do we have? What are our management capabilities? And what are we using that area for? So nitrogen is going to promote shoot growth. And so the more use an area has, the higher amounts of nitrogen you're going to want to use. So versus, you know, an ornamental lawn versus a lawn that's getting soccer played on it, the soccer lawn is going to need more nitrogen. But now with our other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, we can rely on the soil test. And so what can we do? We have soil test calculators that will tell you and help you figure out what fertilizer to buy. This is an example. Now, I just put this nitrogen in here because this is a typical, you know, rate for one application. Maybe I want to put down about a pound and a quarter per 1,000 square feet for my one application, okay? But based on my soil test, they told me that I needed 0.75 pounds of phosphorus and 1 pound of potassium per 1,000 square feet. So they're going to give you a recommended fertilizer ratio that you can see right here. And then they're going to help you out even further by listing common available fertilizers. So this is a drop-down menu. You can look for a fertilizer in that list that is going to be close to matching your ratio. So you can see this one's pretty close, 1.3 to 1 to 1.2. And then even further, it's going to tell you down here what to apply to get that amount. So in order to get 1.3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. A little bit more phosphorus than we got recommended, but it's okay. 1.1 pounds of potash or potassium. It's going to say you need to apply 7.9 pounds of that specific fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. So we've got some calculators to kind of help you out based on your soil test report. So you get your soil test report back, you decide how much nitrogen you want to use in that single application because of your species, you're using your use of that area. And then we're going to be able to just put those recommendations in here, spits you out a good fertilizer ratio. You can choose an available fertilizer in that list or look for one on your own that will help you figure out what kind of fertilizer ratio you need. And so this is pretty helpful, and it's available through our soil, water, forage testing laboratory. So we have a lot of folks that use this, and I even use it to calculate the ratios because it's so easy to do. So it just helps you figure out, hey, this is the type of fertilizer I need. And so how can soil pH affect your availability of nutrients? Now, likely in the majority of your yards, you are probably leaning more on the alkaline side of the pH scale. And so how can it affect it? You know, if we have let's say an 8 pH, then we can see that some of our micronutrients like iron, manganese, they're becoming less and less available. And you can correct me if I'm wrong at the break, but I believe that, you know, most of the soils in the Travis County area also likely have some excess phosphorus in there. And so when we have excess phosphorus, we can see that kind of what we call tie up the available nutrients. And so if you get your soil test, it might say, hey, you've got all this iron in there, but at your pH, it might not be available to your plant. And so that's how we can kind of decipher what's going on in our plant. Now, iron chlorosis is very common in some of our grasses. Specifically, it's really easily detectable in our St. Augustine grasses. And so if you ever think you have iron chlorosis, you can look at your leaf and it will start turning a yellow color. But the veins of that leaf will be bright green. And so that is a sign of iron chlorosis. And so if you ever think you have that kind of problem, we can work with you to figure out the best way to deal with that. Now, I know we're going to get a lot of questions about how we can change our soil pH. And so this is a very site-specific question. There are some general recommendations out there for high pHs, you know, the addition of something like a sulfur-based compound, the addition of a compost, peat moss type of mixture that generally has some type of acidic property. However, a lot of our soils in the state of Texas already have a very high amount of limestone in the soils already. And so the higher the amount of limestone that we have, the harder it's going to be to lower that soil pH because, you know, we add limestone to raise the soil pH, right? And so it can get very, very tough to change our pH. And so oftentimes we'll recommend surface or, you know, 2 to 3 inches down of additions of compost and maybe a peat moss. You can, you know, there are some variability in our types of compost that we have available out there. And so just making sure you know what you're getting. But changing our pH very consistently is going to be very hard in our area. And so this is something where a soil test can also help you, and we can work with you to at least try to have an impact on that surface pH where the majority of our roots are. But just know you're likely never going to be able to change your pH very drastically in our state. Now, this is a general recommendation here of a yearly nitrogen requirement in pounds per 1,000 square feet, depending on the species of grass that you have. And so if you do have a Bermuda grass, the 1 to 4 can range from, hey, I'm just mowing my lawn. Maybe I want to put a pound out to keep it, looking good and keep it healthy, dense. But oh, in my backyard, my kids are running on the grass all the time, or my dogs are running on the grass all the time. Maybe I need to give it a little bit more nitrogen to promote some recovery of that grass in those areas that are getting more traffic. And so what we want to avoid is using excess nitrogen. And so we can see with the increase of nitrogen fertilizer is going to increase water use because that plant's going to want to grow more. So there's kind of that critical level. And once we get beyond that, once we give the plant more than it can use, it's going to either suppress some of our growth, stop our root growth, or be lost to the environment. And so that's not what we want. We only want to give the plant the fertilizer it can use. It would just be like us taking excess vitamins. We can only use so many vitamins to a certain extent. We're just going to get rid of it or not use it. And so we don't want that to happen. And so if you're confused about how much nitrogen you should use, then that's something that our county agents and myself can help you with. Okay, so I see that I am rambling a lot, so I'm going to try to move a little quicker. Some other nutrient thoughts are base your other nutrients on your soil test. So potassium as a nutrient can help us. It's called our stress nutrient. So stress like drought, even some of our cold stress, even some of our mowing stress, potassium can help improve the ability of these plants to recover. And so base that potassium application on your soil test. In combination with nitrogen, phosphorus at the critical levels in your soil can help improve our ability of our plant to recover from drought. Iron in combination with nitrogen can help us increase root production, can help us reduce desiccation or death from drought. But these have to be done in the appropriate amounts. And so that's why it's important to know the nutrients in your soil. Clippings, like we talked about, returning those can provide nitrogen, can help conserve soil moisture. And then fall applied nitrogen. Now, not too late. Now, we typically recommend not to apply any nitrogen after about 4 weeks before your first frost. So if your first frost is coming, I don't know, November 15th, our last nitrogen application should be around October 15th. But this can help us recover more in the spring. Okay, so we are going to go to irrigation, but I'm going to try to go a little quicker. So irrigation, this is in supplement to rainfall, right? And so irrigation by itself or coupled with some other cultural practices like we just talked about can influence the ability of our grass to use water. So what we want to promote, of course, is a deep and infrequent irrigation pattern, cycle soaking to make sure that this water is indeed getting into our clays and not running off. But, a lot of times we will tell folks, hey, use visual wilt to time irrigation. But that can be risky. because it can still lead to some vegetative cover loss. And so if we wait too long, if we didn't catch that visual wilt when we were when it was first happening, it can still lead to some loss. And so this is why it's important to know about levels that we can give these grasses to stop them from going into drought, or allowing them just to go into avoiding drought. And so we were talking about earlier, much of the drought tolerance associated with warm season grasses can be vastly different. A lot of it is through the phenomenon called drought avoidance. So it's just avoiding drought. They're going dormant to avoid dying from the lack of water. And so here's three examples here. Here's Zoysia matrella, which is a very fine textured zoysia grass going completely dormant to avoid drought. And so it's not dying, but it's just going dormant to say, hey, I don't have any water right now. I'm just going to kind of, go to sleep until I get some water. Here's Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is much more drought tolerant than zoysia grass. It can stay green longer with less water. And then good old Dallas grass is staying green way longer than all of these. And so sometimes our weeds are pretty drought tolerant. Now, factors that we use to schedule irrigation. This can get a little bit complicated too, but and I can ask Daphne at the break. But in North Texas, we have a organization called Water My Yard that helps you know how much to water your grass every week. And so they're pretty much taking into account the grass species, precipitation rate, how much rainfall did we get, soil moisture, different types of soils. Most of our soils here are clay based. And so, and it also depends on how much turf water use did occur. So that is based on the evapotranspiration. And so how much water did we lose that week? And so this is how we have come to this conclusion. Can get kind of nerdy, kind of complicated, but basically what we did is we go out and we create an environment where we can put these grasses in, we can water them, and we can come back each day and weigh that tube. So it's a thing called a lysimeter. You can see it here in this photo. Basically, some grad student somewhere is the reason that we know how how much water your turf grass needs. And so we water it to fill capacity, we put it back in that hole, we come back every day that it and we make sure it doesn't rain, come back every day, and we weigh that apparatus to see how much water has been used over the 3 or 4 day period. And so in general, without getting too crazy, we have figured out that our warm season turf grasses only need to um, to get back about 60% of the water that was lost. And so that means that in 1 week, if your evapotranspiration was 1 inch water loss, so through ET during that week, you lost 1 inch of water, you only need to return 60% of that. So about 0.6 inches needs to be returned. So basically, we don't need to return everything that we've lost in order for this grass to grow effectively. So that typical scale of about 1 inch per week that we hear is generally loosely based on this concept. So throughout the year, our ET rates will change. The hotter it gets, the more windy it gets, we can have higher ET losses. And so our watering needs can change throughout the year, but that 1 inch per week is generally loosely based on the fact that we need to return the lost water back to the plant. And so in general, we don't need as much water as we generally think we do. So you can use a lot of guidelines online to help you water your grass, or you might can find an organization that can send that stuff to you. We do have a Texas ET network where you can go in and say, hey, here I am in Austin. Yesterday I lost a 0.1 inch of water. And so, you can get guidelines based on that. And so you can look at it for the week. You can water your grass based on that. Or you can use a preset system that might send you some recommendations. So in general, water or grasses aren't using as much water as we think. Okay, so how do we know how much irrigation are or how much water our irrigation systems are putting out? Now, this is very, very important. I know we've had some questions on weed control, on putting out fertilizer. And so the majority of the time, those bags are going to have some type of recommendation. Hey, you need to water that fertilizer in about 1/4 of an inch. Hey, you need to water that pre-emergent herbicide in about 1/2 of an inch. Well, if we don't know what our irrigation systems are putting out, then it can lead to us using maybe not enough water or too much water. And so doing something like an irrigation audit is is to your advantage. And so you can see here that the majority of our irrigation systems are not very efficient, about 60% or less. And so we can see, poorly aligned heads, poor, you know, poor just settings in general. And so doing irrigation audits can really help you conserve water. You can do them yourself, or you can also have a professional come in and do it. And so, typically we suggest you can get a professional kit from AgriLife if you want to, or you can use something like a tuna can or a cat food can, as long as they're the same size and they have the same opening they really just need to have the same opening. And so basically you go out, in a nutshell, and you grid out your yard, kind of like this bottom right photo. We're going to turn our irrigation system on, or our sprinkler system, our hose, sprinkler, however we're going to water our yard, for a known amount of time. So let's say 15 minutes. And then we're going to go out, we're going to measure how much water is in each of those little cans, or those little catch cans. And so this will help you. So basically you just measure and you average all of your measurements. And that will give you, hey, in 15 minutes, I put out 1/4 of an inch of water. Or in an hour, I put out, this much water. And it will also help you figure out your distribution uniformity. So let's say this was your yard down on the bottom right, but over here on the left side of my yard, I barely had any water in those cans, but I had a lot of water in the right side of my yard. That will let you know that there's some type of issue with the output of your sprinkler. So that's very important. Why do we care about that? Runoff, right? Runoff is a huge thing. You can get fined for it in some of our urban areas if someone turns you in or somebody sees it. And so this is really our #1 non-point source of contamination. It's highly preventable. We can use those cycle soak methods where, hey, I have turned my irrigation system on for 5 minutes and I've noticed that no more water is soaking into my ground. It's running off. Let's turn it off and come back later, and then we'll water it again to let that water soak in there. And so very important for #1, proper water use. #2, we don't want to lose any of the inputs to the environment that we put in, so fertilizer, pesticides. So we want to make sure we're doing our part to keep those on point. Now, the irrigation person will probably talk more about this in next month, but irrigation technology is out there. There are new types of nozzles. There are new systems you can get. There are weather stations you can tie your controllers into that will water based on the ET. There are tons of new technology out there that you can use to replace some older, maybe more wasteful types of spray nozzles. So that's something that you can consider. What else do I have? Okay, this is an example of what we were talking about earlier. Whenever our turf grass goes into basically a drought dormancy or a summer dormancy, where, hey, it's just not raining. We're under a water restriction. We can't water. And so, that's something that uh, you can know that, hey, my grass is not dead. Look at this. This looks almost dead. This is Bermuda grass. But hey, it started raining again later in the year, and our grass came back. And so most of the time our grasses are not dying, but they are going dormant to avoid the drought. Now, some things you can do, of course, and I know most of y'all probably know this. Rainwater, perfect for irrigating landscapes when we have those drought restrictions. You might need a pump, of course, if you're going to use certain types of irrigation. But we have had many folks in the state of Texas that have established a whole lawn by seed just with a rain barrel. And so it can be done. You can water your lawn and your landscape beds with rain barrels. Now, again, timing is a big issue. We want to do the deep and infrequent, maybe cycle soak if we need to. But what we want to do, if possible, is to avoid midday or night irrigation events. Early morning is the most ideal time, about 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. gives us time for that leaf to or the water to evaporate off those leaves, especially when it's hot outside. The longer our leaf is wet, the more risk we have for disease. And so limiting the time of that leaf wetness is very important. So early morning. Sometimes not smart watering doesn't show up until later. So this is a example of someone irrigating late at night in June. Oh, well, it's fine. The grass looks fine. Well, look at November. So this is what can happen. This is a large patch that has come up, but you can also see that it's kind of like a little gully right here. And so most of the water is probably pooling right here. And so, sometimes things that you do during the summer, during the actively growing season, might not show up until later. Okay. Now, we talked about, longer roots are going to reach more water. That can be done from setting our mowing height a little higher, not scalping our lawn, promoting longer roots by not watering lightly and frequently, but deeply and infrequently promotes longer roots to search for that water down to the soil profile. It helps when we have increased water use efficiency through some of our newer types of grasses. And then, of course, these grasses will go into dormancy to avoid drought. Now, we talked about this earlier, but, hey, sometimes there's water restrictions. Sometimes we need to turn it off entirely. Those grasses will go dormant, but they usually will recover once water and irrigation returns in some type of format. So remember, when you're selecting your species, they act differently, and they can go into dormancy much quicker than some of our other species. And we'll talk more about specific species when we get back. Now, it is break time, so we're going to take about approximately 5 minutes. Type your questions into the Q&A. I already see a lot in there, but I'll turn it over to Daphne real quick.
All right, thank you, Dr. Segars. Great information so far. She said we'll take a 5-minute break. We will start back promptly at 11:08, and we'll take about 10 minutes worth of questions that are already in the chat, in the Q&A, and then we'll start back. So 5 minutes, 11:08, we'll be back. All right, Dr. Segars, we do have quite a few questions. So remember, everyone, if you have a question, type it in using Q&A. We're going to spend about 8 to 10 minutes right now on questions, and then we'll loop back at the end. So since we have so many, I'll just start at the beginning. This is a pretty simple one, I think. Any tips you can give for dog tolerant lawns?
Well, not really. Uh, I would say, the more trafficked the area is, you might have to consider, either trying to deter your dog from using certain areas if you need to recover, or you might also have to consider using a little bit more nitrogen and fertilizer in those areas that need more recovery. But, grasses aren't going to be 100% traffic tolerant no matter what. And so if you have a dog that's just constantly running, fence line, then I'm going to have to, be honest and say that there's not going to be much you can do.
All right, sad but true. Next question. 1-year-old St. Augustine lawn, and there's lots of brown areas with some green grass slowly coming back from the recent winter ice and snow. What to do to promote that new lawn growth at this time, given that the freeze that we had?
Right. Yeah, so I would say, still be patient with your lawn right now. There's still a lot of areas, especially St. Augustine, that are starting to grow. Now it also depends on what type of area that grass is in. If it's in a more shadier environment, or if it's maybe in a more compacted soil area, it would have been a little bit more predisposed to potential winter injury. And so I'd say, still be patient, but what you can do, of course, is get your soil test and use some fertilizer and mowing to promote growth. Mowing does promote growth of your grass. And so you can also, if you don't know if those areas are going to come back or not, you can kind of, do some digging on your own, go look down in the canopy, see if you see anything that's green. Also, you could take a little small plug of that grass in the deadest areas that you think, and hey, bring it inside, water it, put it in the light, and see if it comes back. And if it doesn't, then you'll know that you might need to replace that area, or at least get rid of that dead stuff.
That's great advice. Next question's on fertilizing. When should you fertilize newly planted sod, and does it matter type of grass? So St. Augustine, Bermuda, zoysia, are there any differences? Newly planted sod.
So I'll just give a general answer for that, just to make it easy. Generally, we recommend to fertilize a new sod about 4 to 6 weeks after you lay it. Now, specifically St. Augustine, if you were to apply that fertilizer at planting time, we see an increased risk of disease. That might not be as true for our hybrid Bermudas, but hey, just to be on the safe side, you can just say for everything about 4 weeks after. Now, of course, if you want to, now that's generally a nitrogen fertilizer. Now, if you have taken a soil test before you planted that sod and you need to put some phosphorus or some potassium, or hey, maybe lime or some sulfur or something in your soil, then you can do that pre-plant. You can get that down into the soil a few inches. That would be recommended. But if not, then I would wait about 4 weeks.
All right, next one. Does watering a lawn with well water offer more nutrients than tap water?
Well, that is a dependent question as well. I would say, so the same location that you can get your soil tested at the A&M lab, you can also get your water tested. And so, oftentimes well water might be a little more harder, might have more minerals in it, and so it might not be as good as tap water, but there's also no replacement for rainwater. And so rainwater is going to be more preferable than both of those sources. But I'd say if you were questioning your water source, to go ahead and get that water tested as well. You can just send in like a 20-ounce bottle pretty much in the mail, and they can let you know what type of nutrients are in your water as well.
And that website is soiltesting.tamu.edu, and they no longer offer the specific bags anymore. You just send it for soil, you just send it in a Ziploc bag, but it's the same website, as Dr. Segars said, as the soil testing lab, the water.
Bags
Yeah.
anymore.
But yeah, they do water testing. And I would say mostly it's not a nutrient thing with most of the well water that I've seen. It's a salt, and it can be a problem. It can be a detriment, not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question. My lawn has gotten progressively thinner over time, and now I have bare spots. Lots of shady oak trees. I'm glad they gave us that fact there. What can I do to improve my lawn?
So unfortunately, that's just how it goes. If you have a grass under a tree that maybe has gotten more mature over time, and you see that grass start thinning out, that's a sign that that grass is, not loving that area. And so if you were to put grass back in that area, you might just have to be aware that you're going to have to replace that or deal with what comes with that, right? More stresses. And so generally under oak trees, I suggest, if you don't have to put grass there, if you've already got grass there that is thinning out, that's a sign that the grass does not want to grow there. So, you could choose either more shade loving plants or create some type of shade garden under that tree. That would probably be the best use of your time and money.
Yeah, and I think it's good to point out that live oak trees, although they drop their leaves, they do so in the spring and then grow new ones immediately. So there's never a time for the grass underneath to recover the way they would under a deciduous tree like a red oak or some other type of tree that's bare all winter. And you have a little bit of time in the fall and a little bit in the early spring where the grass can get some sun. It's not true under a live oak tree.
Very
We have
true.
a related question on the live oak leaves, because they do drop them all at once and they are so thick and leathery. And is that bad for the lawn?
Well, I would say, I wouldn't say the leaves itself would be bad, but maybe just the shading effect that you're going to get from an excess of leaves. And so, generally, I would remove the leaves from my grass if possible. But if you're going to be able to shred those into smaller pieces, of course, you might can use those in other areas. But generally, I suggest to remove the leaves from the grass.
Yeah, and what I've found is they do, since they are so much thicker, they don't break down and they end up creating just a mat of physical barrier between your grass and the sun that it needs to get growing. Okay, a couple more. Let's see. A small backyard with solid wooden fences on all three sides, and then neighbors have trees on their side. So that to me says shade. They
Yes.
had a nice green lawn at one time, but now it's mostly just dirt. How can they get a nice looking lawn again?
Oh, that's a very tough one. You know, there's not a great answer to that question. If it's going to be heavy shade, there's likely not going to be a grass that's going to consistently grow under there. So, if you send myself an email or maybe Daphne an email, we could help you figure out an option. Grass is not always the answer, especially if it's a heavily shaded environment. But there's something out there for you if you want a plant. If not, you could create some maybe hardscapes in those areas that are heavy shade, and then maybe put some shadier loving plants out there as well.
Yeah, I think, the key is that we talk about shade tolerant grasses, but there are different levels of shade. And you've talked about this extensively already, but generally what I found is if the grass has already died back, you don't have enough sunlight that the grass would need to start. It needs a lot more in the beginning of its lifespan. And so realistically, I would suggest going to something that's heavily shade tolerant and creating some sort of bed rather than having a lawn, unfortunately. And that really is unfortunate if you have animals or something like that.
Yeah.
All right, last question
The
before we.
synthetic route. I know people might not want to hear that, but
Yeah.
heavy shaded areas
Yep.
where you want some kind of lawn look, then might have to go that route.
All right, we're going to do one more, and I think it's a quick one before we go back to the program. How do I keep hybrid Bermuda from invading beds? If any root is left after pulling out of the bed, will it regrow?
So
That's a hard yes.
yes, that is a yes. A lot of folks will create some type of barrier between, sometimes they'll put some barrier under the ground, or sometimes they'll either maybe spray something right next to the bed that will keep the Bermuda grass out, or they will be very diligent about edging in that area. And so it really depends on what you're comfortable with. But yeah, if you just go pull that Bermuda grass by hand, it's going to come back. So
Yeah, that's true. So there's a reason why it grows so well. And we like it so well is it doesn't require a lot of work to get it to grow well, but then it does get in. Like anywhere there's water, there's Bermuda grass on the edge of that, it's going to come up and grow. It just takes diligence to keep it under control.
yeah.
All right, we do still have quite a few questions left, but we will come back at the end and do as many as we can. So with that, I'll toss it back to you to continue on. Thank you, Dr. Segars.
All right. So now we're going to talk about which grass works in my area. So hopefully some of your questions might get answered throughout this presentation. So just talked a lot about shade, right? And so first one we're going to talk about today is zoysia grass. And so this is actually a image, I believe, from the SMU campus where they have a zoysia grass growing there, and it is thriving in filtered shade. And so when I ask someone if they have filtered shade, if they have direct light, if they're going to get any light throughout the day, this is what I'm talking about. And so these trees are still rather mature, but they are at least thinned to a point where you are getting some good shade and light through that shade, right? And so zoysia grass can thrive in all day filtered light. Now, there are two different types of zoysia grasses. There's going to be one species called Zoysia matrilla, which is going to be our finer textured types of zoysia. And commonly, we don't recommend these to homeowners as often, just because they can be a little tougher to manage from the aspect of, aeration, mowing, some of the cultural practices that we might have to do, because they can get a little more thatchy. And so, thatch is that buildup of material right above that soil surface and in between that grass crown. So if you ever walked out on your grass and kind of started feeling like it was bouncy, or you were walking on like a mattress then that's kind of a sign that your yard's a little bit thatchy, kind of puffy. And so in general, the matrilla species can be a little bit more thatchy. Now, if we were to recommend one to a homeowner, it would be this top one. Zeon is probably the easiest to manage out of these for a homeowner, and I've seen it the most on homeowner properties. Okay. Now, moving over to the japonica species, these are going to be more coarse. They're going to be a little bit wider leaf blade, as you can see in this photo. In general, easier to manage. They're not going to get as thatchy. They're not going to be as dense. Now you can see, the mat that's developing over here in the matrilla types, very dense, very, very well held together, where we have a little bit more of an open canopy on the japonica types. And so, a lot of folks love Palisades. Palisades is a great homeowner grass, easier to manage. But they do have some pros and cons. All of these have some pros and cons. And so once we look a little further, the matrilla types will be a little bit more shade tolerant. And so whenever we talk about shade tolerance for zoysia grasses, I'm going to talk about them in relation to direct sunlight. And so the matrilla types can take about 5 hours of direct sunlight. It prefers 5 hours of direct light with some filtered light, but it can also take all day filtered light like we saw in that previous photo. Now, the japonica types, they're going to be more drought tolerant and more cold tolerant in general. However, they need a little bit more sun. And so when we start talking about the japonica species, we are going to recommend about 1 to 1.5 hours of more of direct sun. And so in that 6 to 7 hour range, where we might can get away with 5 with some filtered light throughout the day. And so you can still see that these do need a relatively high amount of sunlight throughout the day. That can be in combination, afternoon, morning sun, doesn't have to be 5 hours, in a row, can be throughout the day. And so just consider what you do have in your yard and consider what you would be willing to do with those trees or with some of those structures that are impeding the light to get more light for your grass. Okay. Now, this is a newer variety or cultivar. So cultivars mean that it was bred in a lab, okay? Variety typically means that it was found in nature. And so, if you go out to the store and you see like a variety of tomato, sometimes that can be naturally selected, right? Now, if we see a cultivar, that means that someone has had an impact in some sort of lab on the genetics of that plant. And so innovation zoysia grass is going to be a cultivar rather than a variety. And so innovation is a cold hardy hybrid. It's a hybrid of the Japonica species and the Matrella species. So it's going to have a medium leaf texture, kind of in between those two, which you can see here. It's going to be very cold hardy. And so it's very interesting because we are testing it right now up in the Panhandle in Lubbock. And it's going to be very interesting to see how it comes out of the spring this year, especially with, the general cold weather they have there, but with the extra cold weather and some late season snow up there too. And so typically this is going to be used more for a golf course fairway or golf course tee, but we do have some really fancy, HOAs in the Dallas area that do have this grass. And so it's very beautiful. And it's definitely a step up from some of our other grasses. So, but you're going to pay for it, right? Let's go back to this slide so I can talk briefly about the cost of grasses these days. So I told you earlier that Dallas has a breeding program. And so when these grasses come out, when they're released for the commercial purchase by a homeowner or by, a sports field, by a consumer, they are put on what is called a patent. And so that patent is going to last for about 20 years. And so let's just use Palisades as an example. Palisades was released somewhere back in the mid 90s by Texas A&M. And so whenever Palisades came out, it was put on that patent, which means that whoever's growing Palisades has to have a license to grow that grass. And so, whenever you call the sod farm and say, I want Palisades zoysia grass, they're going to say, well, it's going to be a little more pricey because it's certified sod. And so when I say certified sod, I mean that somebody from the Texas Department of Agriculture is coming out and making sure that that field of Palisades is indeed Palisades. And so you're going to pay a little bit more because it's on patent. It has to be certified. Now Palisades is off patent. So once it's off patent, anybody can grow it. I could go get Palisades and grow it in my backyard and sell it if I wanted to, but nobody is required to come certify that. And so once a grass is off patent, it's up to the sod farm to either certify it themselves by paying, or for them just to do their best to grow a grass that is true to the type of grass that they're supposed to be. And so that's going to change the cost. And so a certified grass might be, 20 cent, 30 cent more than an uncertified grass. And so that can, play into your budget as well. Do you want a certified grass that is going to be 100% Palisades? Or do you just need a ground cover and you say, well, it's okay if it's contaminated with something else? And so that's where just knowing the differences in those terms will help you out. And so if you were to get certified grass, certified seed even, and something else started popping up in there that wasn't supposed to be in there, like another grass or something, you have the ability to go back to that sod farm and say, hey, I paid for certified sod and I've got like half of this and half of something else. And so they are required to help you on that. So that's just a little blurb about that. So what do you think is happening here? I know y'all can't really respond, but oftentimes I'll get a question and says, well, what if I've got like 3 different grasses in my yard? Is that okay? Like they're intermingled, they look all right. Like, is that bad? Well, not technically. And so the only thing about having warm season grasses that are mixed is just the things we've been talking about. They act differently, right? And so this is 2 different warm season grasses that were planted at our research center in an area where we were testing drip irrigation for turf grass use. Well, the drip irrigation became broken and no one wanted to fix it. And so we were just relying on Mother Nature. So this was in the heat of the summer last year when it was not raining. And one of the grasses started going dormant because of the lack of water. That grass is zoysia grass. Zoysia grass is the brown grass in this photo, where you can probably guess the green grass that is flourishing everywhere is Bermuda grass. And so this is just, a reminder that, hey, whenever this grass is being watered, you can't really tell the difference unless you get close to it and you know the difference between the 2 grasses. And but during certain times of the year, they might look a little bit different, and so you have to be prepared for that. St. Augustine. Now I chose this photo. It's very blurry, but I chose this specifically because of the amount of shade in this photo. I found this photo on gardenality.com, where I was just looking for, weird stuff on the internet, like inappropriate plants guidelines, kind of, hey, what are these public sources saying about, turf grass management? Well, this is where we can get a false hope, right, for how much grass we can grow under the trees. And so this is where I want you to this is why I want you to think about your situation. So this grass, you can tell, is brand spanking new. Look at these lines. You can see the sod lines in the photo. So it's not established. But this, I would love to see what this grass looks like now. This is not enough light for St. Augustine grass. I know that we consider St. Augustine the shade grass, but even St. Augustine needs sunlight. And I will talk about specific requirements when we talk about the different cultivars that are available. But this is where I don't want you to see your a neighbor's yard down the street, or St. Augustine somewhere else under a shade tree, and just think, oh man, that looks great, because we don't know the life of that grass. We don't know when it was put down. We don't know anything about that grass. And so the point is, don't believe everything you see, right? And so this is very typical of St. Augustine. St. Augustine has stolons only, so those above the ground runners only. St. Augustine does not have below the ground rhizomes, below the ground stems. And so in comparison to something like Bermuda grass or zoysia grass that has both above the ground stems, stolons, and below the ground stems, rhizomes, you can't manage St. Augustine as aggressively as those 2 grasses because they don't have any underground structures to come back from. So if you were to accidentally scalp St. Augustine really severely, then it's much more of a risk that you would kill that versus Bermuda grass. And plus it's got a very, very coarse texture. In general, the coarser the leaf, the higher you need to mow. Or if it doesn't have below the ground rhizomes, it might be a little more prone to stress. It's not going to recover as easily as something like Bermuda grass will. So that's just a little blurb. Now, St. Augustine common cultivars that we have in Texas, we do have a variety called Amerishade. Now, I do know that a sod farm in Texas still sells Amerishade. Amerishade is our most shade tolerant St. Augustine grass. You can probably grow it in an area with 3 to 4 hours of sunlight. However, there's a big trade-off when it comes to Amerishade. Amerishade is more susceptible to diseases than these other common cultivars. So if you're going to plant Amerishade, you have to be very cognizant of your management capabilities when it comes to disease management. Now, common is just a variety that's in Texas called Texas Common. We don't really know what it is. Someone found it somewhere and it didn't match up to our other cultivars, and so they just started saying, well, it just came up, so Texas Common. We don't really know what it is. Now, Raleigh, Palmetto, these are probably the most common cultivars in our state, and it kind of splits in about central Texas. So, in general, southern Texas might have more Palmetto. In general, northern Texas might have more Raleigh. Raleigh is more cold tolerant than Palmetto and Floritam. And so we see probably 90% of our lawns in North Texas, Dallas area have Raleigh. Now, it could be split where y'all are. Now, Raleigh is going to need about 6 hours of direct sun or a combination of filtered light as well to thrive. Okay. The more and more I look at that Raleigh, it just seems spelled wrong, but it's just, I guess the more and more you stare at some words, you're like, dang, is that spelled right? But anyway, but it's going to be more cold tolerant. And so Palmetto can take a little bit more shade. So we typically say about 5 hours of sun for Palmetto direct, but of course, an all-day filtered light situation can also work. Now, Floritam is historically known to be very finicky when it comes to cold and when it comes to herbicides. And so if you've ever read a herbicide label that says safe on St. Augustine except for Floritam, then if you've got Floritam, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, Floritam typically is a little bit coarser, but it also has a very purplish color on the stolons and on some of the leaf sheath area. And so if you were to have a more purple tinted grass in some of those characteristics of your grass, and you likely do have Floritam. And so typically don't see that used much central north because of the lack of cold tolerance of Floritam. And then Del Mar is a variety. It's a dwarf variety, so it might have a little bit smaller leaves. But I think the shade tolerance is very similar to the other ones that we've talked about. So in that 5 to 6 hour range. So you can see that really St. Augustine is not that much more shade tolerant than some of our zoysia grasses. And so, of course, this can vary depending on what type of shade you have, tree versus fence versus building or whatever. It can vary. And so you can see that even our most shade tolerant warm season grasses love the sun. Now, this is in my neighborhood when I first moved here. I was walking around, being a nerd, taking photos of stuff. And so this is an area down the street from where I live that has St. Augustine under these trees, but this is the sun line. None of this gets any sunlight throughout the day. Maybe like a morsel every once in a while, but not consistent. So I said, well, it looks all right from afar, but you get up closer and you're like, whoa, woo. And this green stuff is tall fescue. We do have the luxury, or I guess we'll call it a luxury, the opportunity to grow tall fescue in Dallas. And so, but you can see that, hey, it's not looking very good. It's starting to thin out. And so that area really does not need to have grass in it. However, since I took this photo, there was a storm that blew this tree right here down. So the area is getting a lot more light now. And some of the St. Augustine has come back. And so that's just an example. Another example, I took this last year. I was walking around and looking at the neighborhood, and this was right around Halloween time. You can see the pumpkins and the skeletons. So what they did here was just backwards. And so you can see in the foreground of the photo, they've got tall fescue planted And right directly under the tree, they put St. Augustine sod that has not established, right? We talked about earlier how it really needs light to establish too. And if it can get established and then maybe those trees get bigger over time, we might have a better chance at that grass growing rather than trying to establish it under a very mature tree. And now I walked by here the other day. What do you think that grass looks like now? Whew. It's not funny, but it didn't make it through the storm, right? You can see some sporadic leaves through there, but this is what can happen if you put St. Augustine or any grass in an area that is just not going to like it. And so this was pretty much a waste on all fronts. And so it's just showing you some photos. Now, buffalo grass. Now we are about at the cusp of, hey, buffalo grass can grow here, but it might not necessarily love it, right? So buffalo grass really thrives in lower rainfall areas. It really likes 25 inches or less, honestly. And so 35 inches on average is it's okay, but it's not loving life every year, depending on the rainfall. And so about the same in the Dallas area too. And so we have years that buffalo grass will thrive, and we have years that buffalo grass is like, well, I don't really like this, but I'll be out here, trying to grow. And so in general, buffalo grass likes a higher height. We typically say it doesn't need any nitrogen. Well, it doesn't need technically any nitrogen, but it will look a whole lot better if we give it a little bit. And so buffalo grass is a really interesting plant. We talked about it earlier being the only native turf grass that we have. And so, but it's also our only dioecious turf grass plant, which is very cool. And so dioecious just means that the male and female parts of the plant are on separate parts of the plant. And so these little guys that you see above the canopy are the male flowers, and the female burrs are actually down in the canopy. Whereas something like Bermuda grass, St. Augustine are going to have the male and female parts on those seed heads that you see. And so pretty cool. To the fact that if you're looking for buffalo grass sod, you can actually get female only sod. If you didn't like these little male flowers for whatever reason, you can get sod that won't have them. And so, you can kind of pick and choose what you like there. Buffalo grass needs full sun. This is it in the background here. Some other ornamental grass in the front. But buffalo grass likes full sun. It likes 8 to 10 hours. It really likes 8+. And so very similar to Bermuda grass. It really loves the sun. Now, these are the most common varieties that we can find in Texas: 609, density, prairie. Excuse me. Those come as a sod. You can probably find some other varieties as well, but these three down here are our most common seeded varieties. Now, Bowie and Cody are going to be able to provide a more high quality lawn area, whereas Texoka is typically used more for like a pasture or like a rangeland type area, but it can still be pretty as well. But just gonna, they'll have different growth habits. Some of these buffalo grasses will grow only to 6 inches. Some of them will grow to 8. Some of them might grow differently. And so there's new genetics out there for buffalo grass. Now, like I said earlier, we typically hear that buffalo grass is our very sustainable turf grass. We really don't have to do anything to it. It doesn't love water. It doesn't love fertilizer, but here comes those expectations, right? So this was actually my master advisor at Oklahoma State. This was his yard. And so buffalo grass loves Oklahoma. We're getting, we're not getting a lot of rain in some parts of Oklahoma, so it loves it there. And so this is an area where they were not giving any supplemental irrigation during the summer and 0 fertilizer, okay? You can see it starting to kind of go what we call blonde, which, it's okay for your grass to go blonde in the summer. That's fine. But in front of the sidewalk, we're giving it supplemental water, as well as that he fertilized it 1 pound of nitrogen per thousand. So which one do you like better? Typically, the group will say the one in the front. And so this is just a expectation thing. Hey, if you want to give your buffalo grass about a pound and a little bit of water during the hot parts of the year, it's going to look a lot better than if you didn't give it any fertilizer and didn't water it. So just the expectation thing. Buffalo grass loves to be unmowed. I think it's beautiful. It can create a very beautiful native looking area, or you can mow it and it'll look more like a typical turf grass type area. So it's very flexible, I'll say. Now, this is a photo that shows the difference of drought tolerance of Wrangler Bermuda grass, which is typically a more forage type, pasture type Bermuda grass, and Texoka mixed with Cody buffalo grass on the right. So this is in 2012. We had a drought going on in Oklahoma, no irrigation. The buffalo grass on the right has started going into dormancy, avoiding drought. Okay, it's still very drought tolerant, but it has a different mechanism of being drought tolerant. While Bermuda grass is going to stay green longer. But once that buffalo grass starts getting water, of course, it's going to turn back green. But now, however you feel about Bermuda grass is fine, but it will stay green longer than all of our warm season grasses in a drought. Differences of Bermuda versus buffalo. This is why it's so stinking hard to get rid of Bermuda. So here we have a stolon above the ground stem of Bermuda. We have a rhizome of Bermuda grass. That's underground stem. Buffalo only has a stolon. They have no underground stems. Now I'm about to show you at each of these orange arrows is going to be a growth point. Look how many more growth points there are of a Bermuda grass plant than a buffalo grass plant. So that question that someone had about that veggie garden, if you left this small piece, real tiny, of that Bermuda grass rhizome in that ground, it's going to come back. So everywhere there's an orange arrow is a node that can produce some type of root, some type of growing point. And so that's why it's so dang hard to get rid of Bermuda grass. Let's talk about Bermuda grass. So I honestly love Bermuda grass. I think it's the easiest grass to manage if you have the correct site for it. Now, if you've got shade, it's going to be a no-go. So we're already setting ourselves up for failure in this photo. We've got shade going on. We've got, potential areas for pooling going on. And so, this is not a great site for Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass loves 8+ hours of sun, just like buffalo grass does. But why does Bermuda grass not grow where we want it to grow and grow everywhere we don't want it to grow? So this is just an example of a grass searching for the light. And so this Bermuda grass has grown up that cone to find the light and keep growing. Kind of like Daphne said, anywhere there's some water or an area for that Bermuda grass to grow, it's going to start growing. And so Bermuda grass can be your best friend or your worst enemy, right? Now, there's two different main types, and I know I only have about 15 more minutes. I'm going to try to get going so we can answer some more questions. But when we say hybrid Bermuda grass, we mean that grass can only be planted by sod or parts of the grass, like plugs or sprigs or something like that, no seed. So hybrid Bermuda grasses have been crossed in a lab and the seed is sterile. So you cannot purchase any hybrid Bermuda grass, clonal hybrid Bermuda grass seed. Now, common Bermuda grass, you can purchase seed or sod. So anytime you go to like Home Depot or the ag co-op, you get seed from Bermuda grass, it's going to be some type of common Bermuda grass. They can be improved. They can be, selected over time and have improved characteristics, but they're not going to be a hybrid, clonal hybrid, which means I have cross two different species of grass. Now you can see here that the hybrid clonal varieties are denser. They're typically going to be less weedy because they're more dense in nature. They might need to be cared for a little bit more, maybe a little bit more fertilizer to make it look good. It typically likes a little bit lower of a mowing height to look good. Typically going to be used more on sports fields, high quality or more high quality areas, but can be used on a home lawn as well. Now common, you can see, is a little bit more of an open canopy, but still going to be a very hardy grass when it comes to stress. Going to tell you about one new Bermuda grass that's starting to be used commonly on some home lawns in Texas. It's called Tiff Tuff Bermuda grass. Anytime you see a grass with the prefix Tiff, that means it came from the University of Georgia. Here's another hint here. But you're going to be paying premium. This is a brand new grass. It's been on patent maybe for about 4 years, and 40 cents per square foot versus something that was off patent might be about 20 cents per square foot. Now, the great thing about this Bermuda grass is it's very drought tolerant. And so it can stay green longer with less water. Now, a lot of times we get asked, well, how much? Well, I got to pay that premium price. How long is it going to take me to get a return on investment? Now, this was a study done. So let's just say here in Dallas, typical climate, very similar to Austin in rainfall, right? Now, in a typical year, if it rained, no drought year, it would take about 2.5 years for that grass to pay for itself. But in a drought year, if we had drought, it would take about a little over 1 year to pay for that. So you're actually getting a bigger return on investment during a drought year than you would during a typical rainy year. Because, during a drought, you're going to be wanting to use more supplemental water, but with grasses like this, you can actually not use as much. And so this is just a comparison here. Tifway 419 was the first release ever from University of Georgia, so they do a lot of comparisons with it. And so up here in this top left photo is Tifway 419 on the left that has gone into dormancy to avoid drought, where Tiff Tuff is over here on the right, still extremely green. Same down here, Tifway going dormant to avoid drought, Tiff Tuff staying green. Same over here on the bottom right, Tifway going into drought where Tiff Tuff is staying green. And so you can see that it is a vast improvement in regards to drought tolerance. Now, Tiff Tuff is our most drought tolerant Bermuda grass on the market right now. Now, how do you get rid of Bermuda grass? A lot of folks will say, I want to do something in my yard and I got this Bermuda grass. Can I just lay the sod on top of it, or what can I do to get rid of it? Now, you've got to get rid of it unless you want to battle it for the rest of your life, or unless you're okay with it being in there. So if you're going to establish another grass and spend your money to get new sod, you must control the Bermuda grass before establishing either a native plant, native grass, or non-native. So typically we'll say, hey, begin the process as early as possible. Begin that extermination process a minimum of 10 to 12 months in advance of planting. In the process, you can use temporary turf or ground cover during the process to stop soil erosion. Typical recommendations. Now, this is if you want to use a herbicide. We'll talk about other options. You can spray it with a non-selective herbicide. You can go in and till it a little bit, leave it fallow for a while, go back with a herbicide, back with a herbicide. Now, that tillage is recommended to break those underground rhizomes and germinate those dormant buds that we saw in that photo earlier. You remember we saw that long rhizome with like 10 growth points on it. And so we need to facilitate some growth so our herbicide will work. Now, non-selective herbicides, there are a few options out there, and we'll talk about them really quick. Now, the typical non-selective herbicide is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. Now, as with any herbicide, it's always your choice whether or not you want to use it. And so you have to decide that for yourself. So let's just go through all the options. Now, if you don't want to use Roundup, you should know that Roundup was the first patented product that had the active ingredient glyphosate in it. That is off patent now. So anybody can use the active ingredient glyphosate. So you need to start reading your labels, reading the active ingredients in the products that you buy if you want to avoid the use of Roundup. Now, the positive thing about Roundup is that it's a systemic non-selective herbicide, which means that it's going to move down through that plant. And so if you sprayed that Bermuda grass, it's going to be able to move down through that plant and kill those underground structures. Whereas our other non-selective herbicides are contact only. So that means they're only going to kill what it comes in contact with. So if you sprayed Bermuda grass with a contact herbicide, it's not going to move down through the plant and kill the underground structures. Now, there are some other options, like solarization and things like that you can think about using, but those will take a lot longer. And so just a general comparison, we're almost done here. General comparison of buffalo grass versus Bermuda grass. This is common Bermuda grass, depending on your site, cost wise, it could be different for soil preparation, but seed cost, general seeding rate, 1 to 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Seed cost is going to be vastly different. Sod cost is going to be about the same. And so, fertilization will be a little differently. And then, of course, water requirements can vary, but these are our two most drought tolerant warm season grasses. And so if you are interested in looking for some new sod of some of these grasses that we talked about, you can go to this website, texasgrass.com. You can go right here to find a Texas turfgrass producer near you. Click find your grower. Click whatever grass you're looking for, and it will show where in the state it's grown, or you can set some, boundaries and say, well, I only want to drive, 50 miles and see if there's anything near you. And so very useful website. And so that's pretty much all I have. I'm glad this was recorded because I talk very fast. Here's my contact information. Feel free to email me, loop Daphne in. We always like to suggest contacting your county agent first, or your master gardener help desk, of course. And then if it's a problem that they are unable to solve, then we can loop in some of the other experts, or I don't really consider myself an expert, but I'm here to help you as well. And I'll work with Daphne to help you. If you have Twitter, I pretty much just post, photos of my dog. So you can follow me if you want to. And then here's our Aggie Turf website for your use.
Thank you, Dr. Segars. Before we hop into the remaining questions, as many as we can, I want to loop back to your earlier comment about the Water My Yard program that you mentioned.
Okay.
And just point out that Austin Water Utilities does not participate in that program, but we do have several municipalities around that do. Pflugerville, Round Rock, Lakeway, Dripping. We'll include that link to that website in our follow-up email for everyone. But the trick to participating in that would be to pick a location that's near you that does participate, because it's related to the weather stations. And so you can go to the website and put in your location and it will tell you they're not participating, but then look at the list of places that are and choose one of those. And that's the way you can kind of utilize the system without our own water utilities being a part of it. So I just want to loop back to that. All right, we have time for just a couple of questions. So let's see which ones we can get to. First question, what product can I use to kill dichondra and not harm nearby trees or the lawn that the weed is growing in?
Okay, so dichondra, it's going to be a broadleaf weed. And so typically the easiest thing for a homeowner to do is go to, Home Depot or Walmart or something and buy what's called a 3-way chemical. Usually the active ingredient 2,4-D is going to be what has the most activity on dichondra. But there are some other benefits of having the three-way. So the three-way might be something like 2,4-D, dicamba, and
Mycoprop.
MCT. Yeah,
Yeah.
mycoprop. Now they'll have different use rates depending on which species of grass you have. And of course, you should always read the label. And typically, if it's going to have any impact on like a shrub or a tree, it will tell you to stay like a certain, you know, distance away from that plant. But that's what I would suggest. That's the easiest way to get rid of that.
Okay. St. Augustine lawn with some fungus issues for the last couple of years, and now is noticed to take all patch. How do you prevent that and get a healthy lawn?
Well, if that question could be answered easily, I wouldn't have a job probably. So, take all is probably the toughest fungus to, number one, research, and then the toughest fungus to get rid of or prevent once you have it. And so, take all root rot is a very large issue in our state because of our soils. It's a soil-borne fungus, and so what I would say to you is there's a lot of different ways that we can manage that disease, but it's kind of site specific. And so, you might be someone who needs to email me and Daphne, and we can work with that with you. But in general, some common recommendations that I know Travis County already gives is, the addition of the compost every year because our soils are just so terrible. And that will at least benefit the surface pH. And so typically when we start talking about managing take all is taking the environment out. And so limiting the water in those areas, limiting the fertilizer, trying our best to create a healthy root zone for those grasses to grow. But sometimes it's based on our management practices too. So it might be beneficial for me to know what you've been doing, and what kind of site your area is in. So, I would encourage you to shoot us an email if you have a problem with take all root rot.
Yeah, it is very common here and challenging to manage because, like you said, a lot of things play into that situation and they all have to be managed. And if you miss one, like the drainage or something, it just all goes down. So,
It's a
uh,
tough disease.
yeah. 10,000 square foot of St. Augustine under live oak trees that are 300 years old. The live oak feeder roots are close to the surface. What can you do about weeds that won't harm the trees?
Okay. Well, I'll say number one, it depends on what type of weeds you're talking about. But we do have some like pre-emergence chemicals that are safe under trees. So it would really depend on what type of weeds you're talking about because some of our post-emergent products can harm shrubs and trees more often than some of our pre-emergent chemicals are. And so I would just say, read the labels. The labels are there for your benefit. I know they're long and I know, hey, you can read them when you're trying to relax or something and have a glass of wine and read your herbicide label. But a lot of them they're required to put that kind of information on there. And so I would just say, depending on what type of weeds you have, there are products out there that are safe, but you're going to have to read the labels to see that. And so if you have some specific weed questions, feel free to shoot us an email and I can direct you with the products, but it's hard to say without knowing what the weeds are.
Agreed. Yeah, you really do have to identify that weed before you know what to do with it. Will lowering pH with sulfur solve a fire negus issue in St. Augustine? I don't recognize that word. I'm not sure if that's a typo. Is that some type of fungus?
I was thinking that maybe they meant fungus and just typed it wrong.
Ah,
Fire ants?
fire ants or fungus?
I don't know. So
I
we
think
talked about
fungus.
earlier how tough it is to lower the pH in general. And so, if we at least can have an impact on that surface, 2 to 4 inch range, then that's going to help us with some of our fungus issues. And so being sulfur is a tough compound to talk about because sulfur in general is very immobile in the soil, and so it doesn't move very easily. So it's something that we would have to incorporate more in the soil rather than put it on top. And so, coupling those kind of amendments with like an aerification event or something like that, where you're actually opening up the soil, getting it down in there, is going to be beneficial. But sulfur's not all, just plain sulfur's not always the best product to use. So it's really dependent on the formulation of the product.
Okay, and last question we have time for today. Have there been any studies or research in blending multiple species of turfgrass? So curious in the sense of possible succession between turfgrass types and soil, say if it's an understory tree or canopy situation or cover increases over time. So I think that relates to overseeding, but I don't know if you know of any other research studies that are more complex than simple overseeding and say like a sports turf situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, cool season grasses are very commonly mixed together. So, you can buy a bag of like Kentucky bluegrass tall fescue mixture, but that's typically not done on the warm season side. And so, another thing that we're working on at the Dallas Center is a Texas bluegrass, and where we would cross a typical Texas bluegrass with a Kentucky bluegrass. And we're seeing a lot of success down in Georgia for that. But in regards to mixing warm season grasses, we typically don't see that type of thing. But if you're talking about overseeding, like in the fall or something like that, that's something that we see quite often. Specifically for Bermuda grass, that's the easiest grass to overseed without too much worries about it coming back. But St. Augustine is not really conducive for overseeding, and neither is zoysia grass. Just because it's so slow to grow, it can have some issues with competition in the transition time. And so if that's what you were referring to for like a winter color, then that is a common thing, but might not be as recommended in your area just because of the weather. Sometimes it doesn't really get that cold, and so it might not be as conducive for doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Segars. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. We'll follow up individually with any of those questions that we didn't get to. Thank you, Dr. Segars. I really appreciate your enthusiasm for turfgrass and your calm and measured explanation of lawn care and maintenance. Turfgrass does get vilified, but as you've pointed out, with proper management, it can have a place in a water conserving landscape. And thank you to our attendees for participating. Very soon, you'll receive an extensive email from us, including a link to a short survey, and we'd really appreciate if you'd fill that out. Your feedback will help to ensure that Extension can continue to offer these types of valuable programs in the future. That email will also include a link to access to the recording of today's session, a list of resources for further study, and links to any websites or source material listed by the speaker, along with information on how to contact our gardening helpline, as we referred to several times, and how to subscribe to notifications for future seminars in our Drought to Deluge series, as well as other AgriLife Extension programs you might find interesting. Until next time, thank you for joining us and happy gardening.